God, we praise you for giving us the opportunity to be here right now. As we go into 2 Kings, I pray that you will kind of just guide our minds, God, guide our understanding, and help us just shift our thoughts a little bit, because we've been in the New Testament for a little bit. We've been going a little bit more in-depth and stuff, but I pray that we will still find this study just as rewarding, even though it's probably a book that not many people dive as deeply into, God. But it is your word, and so we will learn things from it, and we know that your word will not return void. We pray that your Spirit will be present with us, Lord, guiding us into understanding, so that we wouldn't simply understand the text according to our own limited, finite, human understanding, God, but we would understand it according to your perfect will. We would understand it how you intended it to be understood when you inspired the original authors to write the text. We love you, God, and we praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
All right. 2 Kings chapter 1.
I do have good news for us. So like I mentioned in the prayer, we are going to be going through this a little bit faster than we did go through 1 Peter. Right? Because 1 Peter, we were going like 2 or 3 verses a week. Right? And we were spending like 2 hours on those verses. But I do have good news, is that 2 Kings is going to start us off a little bit easier. Because chapter 1 only has 18 verses. That's fine. That's doable. Sometimes, like back in 1 Kings, there were some weeks where there's like 60 verses in a chapter, and there were times I was like, you know what, guys, we're just going to have to split it up. But this one, I think it's doable. I say that. We'll see. We'll see how the night goes. It could be that we're going to get... Y'all know how this happens. Usually it's like, we'll spend like the first hour and 45 minutes on like 3 verses, and then 15 minutes I'll be like, all right, let's summarize the rest. But what we did last week, for those of y'all who weren't here, we basically just spent 1 week recapping the story of the Bible from Genesis to 2 Kings. Right? And so we just did kind of a sweeping, almost biblical theology of the history of Israel. Just to kind of highlight key aspects of what exactly was going on. I did most of the talking there, which, I do most of the talking anyways, but it was mainly almost just like a 2-hour-long lecture, where basically we were just going Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, all the way through, just looking at the main things. We're not going to do that today, but we are going to spend a little bit of time on context, mainly because, like I mentioned last week, there is probably not a more awkward break between books than in 1st and 2nd Kings, right? Like, it is the most awkward and random place to break a book. Like, 1st and 2nd Samuel, it makes sense. I'll remind you that a lot of the books that we have in our Old Testament, whenever you go to the Hebrew Bible, right, they actually just combine them together into one book, right? So 1st and 2nd Samuel in our Old Testament is just the book of Samuel in the Jewish Bible, right? 1st and 2nd Kings is just Kings, right? Ezra and Nehemiah is just Ezra and Nehemiah. We have the 12 minor prophets. For them, they call it one book, which is called the Book of the 12, and it's separated into 12 sections, right? So we separate things a little bit differently than the Jewish people do. And by and large, I think people have done a very good job at separating them, right? 1 Samuel is the story of Samuel and Saul and the rise of David. And then 2 Samuel is the story of David's reign, right? That makes sense. 1st and 2 Kings, it's genuinely baffling. It's basically like they almost just tried to cut the story in half, but it didn't really work. Like, to me, it would make more sense if 1 Kings chapter 1 through 11, if that was 1 Kings, and then the rest of it was 2 Kings. Because then you would have the reign of Solomon, followed by the divided kingdom. But that's not what we have. Instead, we had all those chapters in 1 Kings, and then literally, the end of 1 Kings begins to tell you about a king for a few verses, and then it just ends in the middle of talking about him. And then 2 Kings just continues. So I don't know, I could probably look this up. I don't know who was in charge of splitting up 1st and 2 Kings, but they just, like, you can tell people just don't study these books very often, right? Because the guy didn't seem to show that much care in regards to how he separated it. But that's not ultimately super important. What I do want to give you real quick, I brought an outline of 1st and 2nd Kings, right? So as you can see here, 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, like I already mentioned, that is still focused on the United Kingdom, right? There were 3 kings of the United Kingdom. That is Saul, David, and Solomon, right? Saul and David, you read about them in 1st and 2nd Samuel. But then, the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings, that's the transition from David to Solomon. Remember, David dies in chapter 2, and then Solomon is kind of reigning all the way till chapter 11, and you get to see him building the temple and all that stuff. It's really cool. Then, starting in 1 Kings chapter 12, all the way through to 2 Kings chapter 17, we do get to see the kingdom once it is divided. right? So after Solomon dies, the kingdom splits in two. You now have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And basically what we're doing as we are going through these chapters is we're just seeing the political dynamics of everything going on right here, right? And so, just to break this section down a little bit more, what we're going to see is that there's going to be a primary focus on three things, and in between those three things, there's just going to be a series of king lists, right? So first off, in 1 Kings chapters 12, 13, and 14, which we've already covered, that focuses on this guy named Jeroboam and the dynasty that came from him. If you remember, Jeroboam was the guy who, he was the slave during, he was a worker during Solomon's time period, and he's the one that God gave the northern kingdom of Israel to. And originally God told him that if he was faithful, then God would establish his kingdom forever, just like he did David's. But Jeroboam's not faithful. And as soon as he creates the northern kingdom, he creates a form of idolatry. Do you remember what he did?
And he puts like 2 golden calves in the temple?
Yes. Well, 2 golden calves. He puts one in the city of Bethel and one in the city of Dan. Right? So basically the northern and southern boundaries of Israel. He creates golden calf worship. Right? So he's returning them back to the wilderness, essentially. Right? It's heartbreaking. And so what we see is that Jeroboam and his dynasty are really, really bad. Then 1 Kings chapters 15 and 16, that's whenever you get those chapters which are just really confusing because it just mentions a whole bunch of kings. And it's hard to keep track of them. And we talk about how it seems like that is the author's goal a little bit. Right? The author is wanting to teach you that this was just a not pleasant time to live in. And therefore, it's like, as you're reading through it, you're almost feeling the same anxiety that the people living in that time period would have felt. Right? To where you don't even know what's going on anymore. Right? There are so many kings, and some of them have so many similar names, and it's just hard to keep track of it. The only thing that you can tell is that nobody is serving God. And then you get to 1 Kings chapter 16, and this is going to be the longest section here, because you'll notice this is going to go all the way through the end of 1 Kings to 2 Kings chapter 13. Right? So this is the longest section here, and this is focusing on a guy named Omri and his dynasty that came afterwards. Omri's son is named Ahab, and he was the one who died at the end of 1 Kings. And then Ahab's son is named Ahaziah. We're going to talk about him today. And what we see is that these guys are just the worst of the worst. Right? Whenever it comes to the kings that Israel had, these guys are just, they're the bad news bears of the bad news bears. Like, they are so bad. And so 2 Kings is going to spend a whole lot of time focusing on them just to drive home how evil they are. And then 2 Kings chapters 14 and 15 is going to give us more king lists. And then in 2 Kings chapters 16 and 17, we are going to see this empire called the Assyrian Empire. They're going to grow in power, and they're ultimately going to come down, and they're going to destroy the northern kingdom. Which then brings us into 2 Kings chapters 18 through 25, which we're no longer talking about the divided kingdom, because one of the kingdoms has been destroyed. Right? So instead we're talking about the surviving kingdom. Right? And those chapters right there are specifically going to focus primarily on the southern kingdom of Judah. Right? Really, the chapters for a while, the very beginning of 2 Kings, is primarily going to be focused on the northern kingdom. Right? So we're going to be not focused on the southern kingdom for several months, probably, as we're going through this. We'll hear them mentioned here and there, but we're mainly focusing on the northern kingdom. But then eventually Babylon's going to rise, and they're going to be the ones to destroy the southern kingdom. And then, at the very end, the final 8 or 9 verses of 2 Kings, we get to see that Yahweh is merciful, and even though both kingdoms have been destroyed, there is ultimately hope. Right? So, I just wanted to give you that so that, like last week, we covered Genesis through Kings. And then, as we go into Kings, I kind of want to just give you an outline so you know kind of what to expect. And if you can tell, we don't exactly have a super encouraging read ahead of us. Right? As we've been going through 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, oftentimes we've compared it to the biblical Game of Thrones. And we weren't talking about this while it was recording last week, but Nick and I were talking about Game of Thrones after we stopped recording. And I was talking about how, I've seen the show and I've read some of the books and stuff like that. But one thing that's very difficult for me about Game of Thrones is that it is very bleak and there is not much hope. And when you're reading the 1st and 2nd Kings, it's very easy to feel that way, right? To where when you're reading it, it feels like Game of Thrones, to where it just seems like everything that's bad that could happen is happening. But as we go through this, I want you to realize that there is both a narrative and a meta-narrative to the story, right? So there is the story being told and the overarching story that you're supposed to read between the lines. right? The narrative is focusing on human sinfulness and man's rebellion against God, right? And how even the chosen people of God, they can't serve him, right? They refuse to. That's the narrative, and that's very bleak. But there is this overarching meta-narrative, right? And what we're supposed to see and what we're supposed to read between the lines is how God is faithful to his people even whenever they are faithless, right? And how God is still pursuing them with his hesed and his goodness, even though they are running away from him, right? That's what we're supposed to see. And so whenever the prophets show up and they're wagging their fingers in the face of kings, it's very easy for us to say, oh my gosh, God is mean. But that's not the message we're supposed to get. We're supposed to say, oh my gosh, God is good, right? Because he's not giving up. Because he could, right? He doesn't have to send the prophets, right? He could let them waste away. He could let them destroy themselves. He could abandon his covenant, and there'd be no salvation. But that's not what he does. Instead, he relentlessly pursues and is faithful, right? So as we're going through this, I want you to realize there's the text that is written, and then there's the theology that is being implied by the text. And we're trying to arrive at both of those, all right? So, that being said, we're still not jumping quite into chapter 1 yet. I want to read a few verses from the end of 1 Kings just to remind us of the immediate context. But let me have some of y'all do it, just so it's not just me reading the whole time and talking. So, like I mentioned, 1 Kings detailed, you remember Ahab, right? Ahab was the guy who was married to Jezebel. We'll be talking a lot about him today, probably. But Ahab died at the end of 1 Kings, literally in the last chapter. And so I figured maybe we could have somebody who could read the story of Ahab's death right here. So we got verses 34 to 36, and then I'm going to need somebody else to read the verses after that in a second. Nick, could you read that? And then okay, and then Ben. Cool.
Now a certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel in a joint of the armor. So he said to the driver of his chariot, "Turn around and take me out of the fight, for I am severely wounded." Now the battle raged that day, and the king was propped up in his chariot in front of the Arameans,
Yeah.
and died at evening, and the blood from the wound ran into the bottom of the chariot. Then a shout of lament passed throughout the camp close to sunset, saying, "Every man to his city, and every man to his land."
All right. Ben, could you read the next few verses?
Sir. So the king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried the king in Samaria. And they washed the chariot by the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood. Now the harlots bathed themselves there, according to the word of Yahweh which he spoke. Now the rest of the acts of Ahab, and all that he did, and the ivory house which he built, and all the cities which he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Ahab slept with his fathers, and Ahaziah his son became king in his place.
Perfect. All right. So that is how Ahab died. Ahab, not a great guy, right? 1 Kings devotes a lot of time in the final chapters to detailing how bad Ahab and his wife Jezebel were. So somebody just summarize for me. How is it that Ahab died there?
He completely by accident almost, because I guess, was that a random just person
Yes.
on the street?
Well, no, so they're in a battle. They are in a battle, but
So some random archer from the other side of the battle, or even on, is it clear which side?
it is on the opposing side. Yeah.
Just draws his bow and strikes Ahab in like a chink in his armor. Like old medieval armor was structured in such a way that there were points where there wasn't much armor in it because it allowed for more movement of the joints. And the arrow struck there and caused a fatal wound because there were some places, especially around like under the shoulder and whatnot, that could get hit, and if an arrow strikes you the right way, suddenly dead. So
Sorry, that was an Amazon package. I'll get it later. Okay. So the story with Ahab is really funny because if you remember in the previous context of that chapter, basically Ahab, he's the king of the north. He goes down to Jehoshaphat, the king of the south, and Jehoshaphat's actually a really good king. He's got some issues, but by and large, he's one of Judah's better kings. And Ahab basically strikes a deal with him and says, hey, would you like to go battle the Arameans with me? Right? Aram is basically Syria, right? Basically just imagine the map of Israel, a little bit north and to the east, right? Just like right up there, that's where the Syrians are from, the Arameans. And they're like, hey, let's go fight them. And Jehoshaphat said, I would like to talk to some prophets of the Lord. And Ahab said, oh, we've got prophets. And so they brought the prophets forward. Remember, there were 400 prophets. And all the prophets said, the Lord will be with you. Go and win the battle. But remember, Jehoshaphat was skeptical. And he was like, I don't buy this. Are these prophets of the Lord or these other prophets? And Ahab says, well, there is one prophet of the Lord, but I don't really like him because he never says anything good about me. And then they brought forward this guy named Micaiah. Right? And Micaiah is one of my favorite prophets in the whole Bible because he's just sassy. He basically just shows up and Ahab says, hey, like, how's this battle going to go for me? And Micaiah says, oh, dude, you're going to win. And Ahab says, be straight with me. And Micaiah says, oh yeah, you're totally screwed. You're going to go to this battle and you're going to die. And Ahab says, let's lock this guy up because he is not speaking the words of the Lord. And Micaiah says, yeah, if I'm not speaking the words of the Lord, then I will see you again. But if I am speaking the words of the Lord, you're dead to me. And so that's kind of how that story ends. And then we come to the battlefield, right? And you remember Ahab, he actually disguised himself, right? Jehoshaphat went into battle dressed like a king. Ahab, he just disguised himself like a normal soldier because it's almost like he's trying to trick God into like him not dying, right? So he goes to fight because he doesn't want people to draw attention to him because obviously people would try to kill the king. And so Jehoshaphat, he's about to be killed, and then Jehoshaphat says, no, my battle's not with y'all, and he gets out of there, right? And then you have a random archer who just knocks his bow, and he's just shooting at what he believes to be a random soldier, and he accidentally kills the king of Israel. And that's what I'm saying, where there's the narrative and meta-narrative, right? Because if you're looking at it, it just looks like an accident. But if you're looking at the overall story, well, this is God's sovereignty, right? God is the one who guided the arrow. Like, the archer did not know what he was doing. The archer did not know, like, he wasn't trying to kill the king of Israel. He thought he was just killing another soldier. And then it just so happened that that arrow went right through the hole in the armor, and it killed the king. And then it ended up bringing about fulfillment of prophecies about Ahab's blood being, like, licked up by dogs and stuff like that. You basically see that he just was not respected in his death. Keep all that in mind, because that's going to be important going into 2 Kings. And then, if you kept reading from verses 41 onwards, this is where 1 Kings kind of shifts. It talks about Jehoshaphat for a little bit. That's the southern kingdom dude. We're going to skip over him for now, because he's not as important to what we're going through today. And real quick, we do have to read these verses right here, because this is that awkward break in regards to the 1st and 2nd Kings thing. Because it's going to start talking about Ahaziah, and then the book is just going to end. Right? It seems like they should stop at verse 50 and then say verses 51 to 53 for the text we're going through today, but they didn't. So can I get somebody else to read these verses? Go for it, Robert.
Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel and Samaria in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he reigned 2 years over Israel. And he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and walked in the way of his father, and in the way of his mother, and in the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. So he served Baal, and worshipped him, and provoked Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger, according to all that his father had done.
Perfect. Thank you, Robert. So, what do we see about Ahaziah right there?
Bad dude.
Bad dude.
He just continued what had been set forth previously by the other kings of Israel, and the fact that none of them were right in the eyes of God, and all of them, provoked him to anger in one form or another.
Yeah. One thing that we've talked about as we've been going through this is that, of the southern kingdom, of the kings there's a handful of good kings. Not many, but there's at least a handful. And in the northern kingdom, not a single one is good, right? Every single one of them are horrible. Right? And it's really sad whenever you look at it that way. But there's three people that Ahaziah is compared to. Who are they? He walked in the way of his father,
his mother, and Jeroboam.
Jeroboam. Right? So who was his father? Ahab. Who was his mother? Jezebel. And then you got Jeroboam. Right? And if you're thinking about the three most evil people in the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, it's them. And so Ahaziah, just from the beginning, we know this guy's not great. And he's only going to last 2 years, but apparently it was quite an eventful 2 years if, he could earn that reputation during that time. Right? So he is no better than Ahab, no better than Jezebel, no better than Jeroboam. He is born into the same vein. This also probably should just be a warning to us, applicationally speaking, in regards to the legacy that we hand down to future generations. Right? The sins that we allow in our own lives, and the things that we do not quench and mortify in our own lives, our children are going to suffer with that, right? Because if we don't take care of the lust in our own lives, well, guess what? Our kids are going to follow our example, right? I mean, yes, there might be exceptions to that rule, but they're fighting an uphill battle, right? And so the things that we tolerate in our lives will be passed down, right? What started with Jeroboam has now snowballed into people like Ahab and Jezebel and Ahaziah. And it's only going to get worse and worse till ultimately the kingdom that they built lies in ashes. Right? And so just be aware of that. That's something that we, even before we jump into 2 Kings chapter 1, just something to be aware of. That being said, are you all ready to go into chapter 1? I always get kind of excited whenever we're starting a new book. It's kind of fun. And technically, since 2 Kings is like part of 1 Kings, it's not really a new book, but I'm going to count it. I'm just kind of excited. All right. 2 Kings chapter 1, Ahaziah and Elijah. Verses 1 through 4, this is what we got. Now Moab revolted against Israel after the death of Ahab. And Ahaziah fell through the lattice in his upper chamber, which was in Samaria, and became ill. So he sent messengers and said to them, "Go, inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, whether I will live from the sickness." But the angel of Yahweh said to Elijah the Tishbite, "Arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say to them, Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Now therefore thus says Yahweh, you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but you shall surely die." Then Elijah departed. Alright. Anything that sticks out to y'all there?
Ahaziah is also seemingly going to die through an act of God. Because the image of him just falling seemingly at random and then catching a sickness is like very striking.
Yeah.
For
Yep. What else sticks out to y'all?
Can't understand why you would go after a god that doesn't exist. The god of Ekron.
Yeah. We'll talk about that.
You got the living God on your side. If you're doing what's right, which here we don't see that happening.
Something that I look and see is Elijah the Tishbite led an Israelite, and he's
So I will clarify that Tishbite, like Tishba, is most likely a city in Israel. So that can be kind of confusing now. But yeah. All right. Anybody just want to summarize those verses for us? Then we'll just walk through them. What happens?
Moab revolted. Elijah fell through his upper chamber.
Or Ahaziah did. Yeah.
Ahaziah became ill. He asked one of his people to go up and ask about Baal, the god of Ekron. And then the angel of Yahweh told the same guy to go to Samaria and ask if there is no God in Israel, that you are going to inquire of Baal. And then after that, Yahweh tells Elijah that
Ahaziah.
Ahaziah would come down from the bed where they had gone and surely died.
Yeah, perfect. So basically, Moab revolts against Israel. And to be clear, we're going to talk about this in a second. Verse 1 is kind of just introducing the next several chapters, because we're not actually going to read anything about that revolt until chapter 3. But chapter 1 is just kind of introducing us to the thought, and then it's setting up that conflict. And then we kind of cut to verse 2 and onwards, and we're going to talk about just some other stuff along the way. Let's walk through it. Sound good? Now, Moab revolted against Israel after the death of Ahab. Hey, Joseph. So, Moab. What do we know about Moab? If you're picturing Israel on a map, it is to the east. Very good.
On the other side of the Jordan River?
Yes, so it's on the other side of the Jordan River, kind of on the Dead Sea area, right? That's where Moab is at. Anything... I'm not looking for a particular answer here. But what all do we know about Moab? Anything else?
Are they kind of related to the Israelites?
They are. Do you remember who they're descended from?
Esau. Yeah.
It's in Genesis, right?
It is in Genesis. It's not from Esau, though. Do you remember who is? This is just Bible trivia at this point.
Don't.
I like to quiz y'all on this because I like to remind y'all. Do you remember who is descended from
I
Esau?
literally read this the other day in Genesis, and I can't remember off the top of
Who's the
my
one
head.
descended from Esau? It starts with an E.
Edom.
Edom, yes. All right. But Moab and its sister country, Ammon, they are descended from the same person. Do you remember who that is?
Oh, this is an Exodus, gosh.
It's a pretty messed up story.
Where am I looking in Genesis? Is that
It's fine. I'll just tell you. It's Lot.
Yeah,
Remember Lot and his daughters.
Oh,
yes.
Genesis incident.
Yeah, Genesis chapter 19.
Yeah.
So, Moab and Ammon, they come from Lot and his daughters whenever they seem to have thought that after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, they were, the only ones left alive on the planet or something. And so they were like, I guess we have to get our dad drunk and sleep with him. And I was like, or you can just walk around for a little bit and make sure there's no one else. But, so that's where Moab and Ammon come from. And the house of Judah actually has a familial connection to Moab. Do you remember why?
There we go. Yeah.
What was the question?
King David was related to a Moabite. Ruth. Yeah, so if you remember, Ruth was a Moabite woman who left Moab to join her mother-in-law Naomi, and then eventually she married a guy named Boaz and basically became the great-grandmother of King David. Right? So the Southern Kingdom of Judah, they have connections to Moab. And main thing you need to know is that ever since the time period of David, Moab seems to have been subjected to both Judah and Israel. Right? Because David, if you remember, he was just this warlord. Right? He was a conquering king. David is largely the reason why the Jewish people of the first century had the view of the Messiah that they did. Right? Because he's the son of David. Right? David was a warlord. He was a conquering king, so they expected the Messiah to be the same way. And David, during his time period, he is the one who basically subjected everybody to himself, so that by the time Solomon reigns, Solomon is reigning during time of peace. Remember, Solomon's name literally means peace, shalom, right? Shalom. And so David was known for just subjecting everybody, and he subjected the Moabites, and it seems like over the centuries, Moab had been subjected to both Judah and Israel. Ahab, he might have been a spiritually bad dude, but to his credit, he did know how to maintain a certain level of power, right? And ultimately, as a political king, he was somewhat successful, right? Spiritually, he was, just a bunch of poop. But when it comes to being a politician, he was actually decent, right? A lot of the different religious compromises he made alongside his wife and stuff were for political advantages. And so he was a somewhat decent king, and Israel was doing all right during his time, other than the drought and stuff that came. And so during Ahab's time period, Moab continued to subject themselves to Israel. But then what happens?
He dies and they revolt.
Yeah, why do they do this?
Well, I don't necessarily know why they specifically do this, but usually in times of history, if a, like, fear-mongering conqueror has been subjecting a land of people to a tyrannical rule, and they are suddenly, dead, then it often ends up in revolts because they feel like the people of those areas feel like they can take advantage of the chaos and all that can be caused by an event like this.
Yeah, well, politically speaking, it just makes the most sense, right? Because here you've got this guy who was established as king for a while, and then it's not like his death was expected, right? It's not like he had prepared for his death to arrive. Like, it wasn't like he had gotten sick. No, he died in battle, right? And so now you've got this somewhat successful king who is suddenly just gone, and Israel is kind of in shambles trying to figure things out. If you are somebody who has been subjected to them, this is the perfect time to revolt, right? Because they are so focused on trying to figure out who's in charge now and trying to establish that. The new king is not going to be necessarily prepared or equipped to handle something like this right off the bat. And so if you're trying to find a time to revolt, this would be it, right? Because it could be that the next king does not, he's not a good leader, and you might be able to revolt later, but it also could be that he's even worse than his dad, and he's even better at subjecting him. And so the best time is literally to just take them by surprise and revolt. So that's what Moab did, right? And so we see that while Ahab, politically speaking, was somewhat successful, it seems like the Moabites in general, as they're looking at the situation, they recognize that the kingdom itself is beginning to kind of falter to the point that they're like, yeah, we can take them on, right? They recognize that Israel is no longer what it once was under David and Solomon, or even Jeroboam, right? Things are just not looking good, and they say, okay, we're going to revolt. Well, like I said, we're not really going to be talking about that very much for several chapters, so just keep that in the back of your mind. The Moabites revolting against them, that's going to play into chapter 3. Now we're going to kind of shift our thoughts a little bit, and verses 2 and onwards are kind of address something a little bit different. Let's talk about Ahaziah. And Ahaziah fell through the lattice in his upper chamber, which was in Samaria, and he became ill. All right, what happens?
So
He basically falls and becomes sick.
a lattice is sort of like a paneling that they would have in their bed chambers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's sort of like if you've seen waffle fries, it's that same sort of pattern.
Yeah, so basically this dude, he's somewhere in his palace, right, in the upper chamber, probably in a place it's probably supposed to be a more relaxing place, right? That's what the lattice, the reason why lattices were constructed the way they were was just to kind of help with ventilation and stuff. Keep in mind, back then, they didn't have air conditioning, right? So he's probably in a place relaxing, and I think part of this is just supposed to be kind of funny, just because, keep in mind, this is one of the first things that we are learning about the king, practically speaking. Anything else we've seen so far is just summarizing, he was a very evil guy. This is the very first thing that we see him doing, right? Here he is, exalting himself to a high place, and he's brought down. But it's not even in a mighty way, right? This is something that could literally happen to anybody, right? It's like if somebody were going through the attic right now and just fell through the roof, right? It's more just embarrassing.
I get a very comical image in my mind of
My dad did that once.
Yeah, well, no, that's what I'm saying. It's something that can literally happen to anybody. Here you've got this guy who has been exalted to the status of king, yet the injury that he sustains is something that could happen to a poor person just as easily, right? And so it's kind of funny that this is the opening image that we are given to of Ahaziah, because it lets us know right off the bat that you're just not supposed to take him that seriously, right? I mean, God doesn't take him that seriously, and the rest of the story is going to show that he doesn't deserve to be taken seriously, because this is a guy who is so lost in his idolatry he doesn't even think straight. And so the whole story actually begins with something that really is just an everyday occurrence, right? It's kind of like you stub your toe, right? It doesn't say that God's the one who struck him down or anything. No. He was literally just chilling one day, fell through the roof, landed on the ground, and he hurt himself. And I guess the injury that he got, whenever it says ill there, I don't know if it's saying that he got physically sick, or if that's just the Hebrew way of saying that he had a prolonged injury.
Well,
right? But I'm assuming it's physically sick
it can
because
be
he's going to die.
one and the same, especially in that time. if you get injured in such a way that a wound opens up on your body,
Yeah.
and they don't clean it properly, then you can get sick from that.
Yeah. So the idea is that he ultimately is bedridden. He can't move around or anything, and most likely he probably did get something infected, and it's just not going super well for him now. Was somebody going to say something?
No.
Okay. So Ahaziah fell through the lattice in his upper chamber, which was in Samaria, and he became ill. I just want you to keep in mind, what city are we in? Samaria. What is Samaria?
It's the capital of Israel.
It is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. I also just want you to remember what city we are in, because that's going to be important for later on. Just remember, we're in Samaria. Applicationally speaking, one thing I could probably mention here is that a lot of times we do over-spiritualize things a little bit, and we want to think anytime something bad happens, ooh, this is a sign from the gods, or a sign from God. This thing with Ahaziah here, later on, there are going to be things to him that are direct messages from God. But this first thing is not supposed to be a judgment on his character, right? It's not saying he only fell because he was evil against the Lord. Not necessarily, right? This could happen to literally anybody. However, I do think it's funny that the author chooses to highlight that moment, because it lets you know where the author stands in regards to Ahaziah, right? He doesn't give us more details to try to make the guy look better. He's like, nah. Main thing you need to know about Ahaziah, dude fell through the roof, he got injured, he's basically on his deathbed. It's like, wow, that's anticlimactic. So, he sent messengers, and he said to them, go, inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I will live from this sickness. Alright, so how does Ahaziah respond?
Go find a false god and ask him.
Yeah.
Isn't that the god Jezebel worship?
So there is debate about this because of the title itself. We'll talk about the title in just a second. But at the very least, this god, whether he is the same god or not, his name is at least associated with the god Baal. Right? It's really, we don't know if it's supposed to be two separate gods. I'm assuming it is two separate gods. Mainly because Baal, we know, like Ahab's wife, Jezebel, she worshipped Baal, right? But she was from Sidon, right? That's up in the north, right? And the word Baal just means Lord, right? And so it can kind of be thrown around interchangeably. And if you remember, actually, I'll save that information in a second because it's going to be relevant. This person is called Beelzebub, which actually means something different, which we'll talk about. But before we even talk about the name Beelzebub, who is this god the god of?
Ekron.
Ekron. Does anybody know where Ekron is? Or what it was? You don't even know where it is on the map, but it is one of 5 cities which is chiefly associated with a certain group of people. Yes, the Philistines. Yes, very good. So Ekron was one of the chief cities of the Philistines. And so basically, you've got this Israelite king who wants to worship a Philistine god. And he cares about what the Philistine god has to say. Which is also interesting, because if you're picturing the map of Israel, right, of the whole land of Israel, where is Philistia at on the map?
It's to the...
Is it the southwest?
Southwest, very good. Like where we think of modern day Gaza, right? Like that is, because Gaza was one of the cities, right? And so that area right there, literally like where the Gaza Strip is at, that is basically modern day Philistia, right? Which is interesting because nowadays it's called Palestine, which comes from the name Philistine, right? And so that is Philistia, but that's in the south. And so if you just think about the imagery here, right?
North, and you worship someone south.
Yeah, Ahaziah is sending messengers south to inquire of a god. Where should he be sending them to? What other city is in the south that might have a god who Ahaziah should be worshiping? Jerusalem. Right? Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom of Judah. And so, if you're just imagining this, he's in Samaria, and there's
through Judah anyway.
yes, they're having to pass through Judah anyways to get to Philistia. But he says, no, just go to Philistia. So he is literally just overlooking Yahweh. And he says, I want to hear from Beelzebub. Now we have to talk about the name. Beelzebub. Anybody know what it means?
Nope. But I know it's very similar to another name.
Isn't it associated with the devil or demon?
So by the time you get to the New Testament, it is associated with either the devil or a demon. Basically, we don't know if that's how it's being employed here. But yes, later Jewish thought definitely is so like basically this becomes a nickname for the devil, or just one of the
So you
chief.
said Baal means Lord, so Baal's above, Lord of above. Now we need to derive what's above.
Yes. So it means of the flies, right? So it's Lord of the flies.
Lord of Death, basically, I guess.
But here is the interesting thing, and let me just double check this just to make sure I am not incorrect,
Well,
just because I don't want to misspeak.
Lord of Flies. Can you basically call him like Lord of Death or something?
So that's why I want to just check real quick.
Stretch on it.
Yes. Okay. So what this most likely is this is the author's way of insulting this God. Because we really don't know much more about Beelzebub outside of this reference here and also in the New Testament whenever Jesus refers to him. More likely what the God's actual name was Beelzebul, right? Beelzebul means exalted Baal, right? Or Baal is prince, or Baal of the heavenly dwelling places, right? That's what Beelzebul means. And all you have to do is change one letter to make it Beelzebub, right? And so this seems like this is the author's way of kind of spitting in the face of this God, right? So most likely Ahaziah did not say, go inquire of Beelzebub. He probably said, go inquire of Beelzebul, right? And the main reason I highlight this is because we have one other instance of this back in 1 Kings that we talked about. Do you remember what it was? There was a character who we've already talked about today, whose name most likely is not what we typically know it as. Yeah, I know you weren't here. Jezebel, right? We know her as Jezebel. Most likely, her actual name was Jezubel, right? Jezubal. Because Jezubal, it means where is Baal? And we know she worshipped Baal. Whereas Jezebel means where is the dung? Like where's the poop? And so this is like the author, this is the author giving like snide comments, like, just like rather than calling them by their actual name, he's not even giving them that respect, right? He is not going to honor their names by recording them in history. And so he's just like spitting in their face by just changing things. That's most likely what's happening here. We can't confirm that. But if you just know how languages work, and we know that Hebrew people cared about what words meant, it seems most likely like, who's going to name their daughter where's the dung? Probably nobody. But a Baal worshiper would name their daughter Jezubal, right? And so that's most likely what's going on there. And then this is probably Beelzebul, but the author calls him Beelzebub. And so this is kind of the author's like tongue-in-cheek way of just making fun of Ahaziah once again, just through the shift in one letter. So go inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I will live from the sickness. So what does he want to know?
Whether I live or die.
Yeah, am I going to live or am I going to die?
Which, if he's inquiring of a god of death, that would make sense.
Yeah. And also, it just seems to imply that he thinks that this God would have this answer. Which is ironic, because like I said, we don't know anything about this God other than what's mentioned here and in the New Testament. This could be the same as the other Baal, but it seems like Baal in general is just a term used to refer to the gods by and large everywhere, like in this area. And so it's kind of hard to determine exactly who Baal's referring to. But the ironic thing is that we just don't know much about this God, which means that he didn't stand the test of time. Nobody else, like when it comes to, like what I'm trying to convey is that this God himself was not destined to ever live or for his name to live on. So how can he possibly give Ahaziah an answer in regards to whether he would live? Right? The history books have literally forgotten this God. How would he be able to give Ahaziah an answer to this question? But it lets you know where Ahaziah's heart is at. Right? He is willing to go past Jerusalem to get to Ekron. Because that is how deep the idolatry is in his heart. But the angel of Yahweh said to Elijah the Tishbite, "Arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say to them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron?" All right, what happens there?
So technically, well, just from looking at verse 3, that Yahweh sends a messenger to Elijah, and that messenger from Yahweh, by Yahweh, tells Elijah, go to somewhere.
He's basically intending for Elijah to meet the messengers that Ahaziah is sending to Ekron on the road to where they're going, because, if he's having to head through Judah and where Elijah is at is along the way, then it would make sense for him to just send him up the road to meet the people who are already coming down that way, to basically ask those messengers, why are you heading towards Ekron if, are you going there because there's no God of Israel? Basically saying, I should be your God. That's who you should be worshiping, not this God down in Ekron in Philistine.
Yeah, so why are you going that far? Right? Why are you not coming to me? Right? That's ultimately what he's communicating here.
Mm-hmm.
Maverick highlighted the fact that it says that there's a messenger from God. Right? Remember, the word angel just means messenger. What's interesting is that every other time so far we've read about Elijah, because remember he was featured a lot in the end of 1 Kings, it's Yahweh speaking directly to him. But now it says the messenger of Yahweh came to Elijah. Whenever we read about the messenger of Yahweh, who do we typically interpret that to be? Not just a messenger, the messenger of Yahweh, the angel of Yahweh. Who do we typically interpret that to be? Jesus, right? So whenever you actually look throughout the Old Testament, whenever this person shows up, it's hinted and clearly stated in several places that this is not just any messenger, this is Yahweh himself in the flesh. Right? So it is somebody who is taken on flesh, he is walking amongst them. This is what many people call, the fancy theological term is a Christophany. Right? It's basically an appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ. Right? So we're not saying that Jesus was born of a virgin, was raised up, and then lived out this moment just to get here. No, he took on flesh temporarily to deliver this message, and then he left. Right? This is kind of how we typically interpret this, right? So Yahweh sends the angel of Yahweh, this would be Jesus, to go and deliver this message. That's kind of cool. Not really much to do with that information here, other than the fact that there's a lot of messengers in this chapter, right? So Yahweh sends his messenger to Elijah, who is going to send a message to the messengers of Ahaziah, and then Ahaziah is going to send more messengers. There's just a bunch of messengers, right? So that kind of seems to be the running theme here. So the angel of Yahweh says to Elijah the Tishbite, arise, go up. Notice just I just want you to notice the imagery here. Arise, go up, right? Elijah is ascending, right? Arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say to them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you're going to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? So he says, I want you to go up and challenge them. Right? Were they planning on visiting Elijah? Nope. He says, I want you to go and make them uncomfortable. Right? He says, you're going to get up, and you're going to basically, you're just going to,
harass them.
Yeah, you're going to harass them. Yeah, you're going to show up, and you're going to give them a nice little surprise. Right? One thing that you'll know about Elijah is that people, whenever Elijah shows up, everybody's just oh no. They usually know it's not a good sign, because Elijah, if you remember this was how Ahab responded to him. Remember there was that guy named Obadiah, right? Obadiah, this is back in 1 Kings. He got nervous whenever Elijah shows up because he's like, oh man, you don't have good news for the king, do you? Because basically Elijah, he was always under the divine protection of God, and he would always just show up out of nowhere and leave out of nowhere without he's kind of like Batman, right? To where it was he would just, he wouldn't let you know when he was coming, he wouldn't let you know when he was leaving. He would show up, he would ruin your day, and he would leave. That's kind of how Elijah works. And so that's kind of what he's being sent to do here, right? These guys, they're just the messengers, right? They're simply doing what the king told them to do, and God says, I want you to go up, and I want you to confront them. And I want you to ask them a difficult question. And you can imagine Elijah just speaking with straight up sarcasm. Oh, y'all must be going down to Ekron because the God of Israel must be on a vacation or something, right? And you remember whenever he was taunting the prophets of Baal, right, at Mount Carmel? Where's your God? Is he taking a nap? Maybe he's using the restroom. Maybe he's on vacation. I don't know. Maybe he just doesn't hear you. Cry a little louder. Cut your arms a little bit more. Do something. And then Elijah goes and just like prays to God, and boom, the fire comes down and consumes the sacrifice. Right? And so Elijah, very sarcastic guy, very loud, boisterous person. This is right up his alley. God says, get up, go, deliver this message, challenge them. Right? I want you to ask them, why aren't you asking Yahweh? Right? That's what he's getting at. Because obviously the answer is, yes, there is a God in Israel. Even if the people are rejecting that God, he hasn't rejected them yet. Right? He's going to eventually, but he's still be faithful even then. But there is still a God in Israel. Which is also interesting because where technically does God's name dwell at this time period? Jerusalem, which is not in Israel, it's in Judah. But even though God dwells in Jerusalem, the implication is that he also dwells in Israel too. Because God, he can't be confined to a simple building. Right? Yes, he might dwell in that place in a specific and special way, but he's also the all-powerful creator of the heavens and the earth. And he can be wherever he wants to be. And so, yeah, he is the God of Israel. And in many ways, even though the kingdom is divided, he still treats them as a whole. Right? And so it's not like he only loves Judah now. No, he loves all of them. Were you raising your hand or stretching?
Stretching.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say, you don't have to raise your hand. Just cut me off and talk. All right. But the angel of Yahweh said to Elijah the Tishbite, arise, go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say to them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Now therefore, thus says Yahweh. Those are always like the most terrifying words. Yes. Thus says the Lord. It's like, oh gosh, this could either be really good or really bad. Now therefore, thus says Yahweh, you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but you shall surely die. Then Elijah departed. I just want you to once again notice the visual imagery of all this. Right? Remember Hebrew, it's a very the language of Hebrew is very limited in what it can do because it's very just small vocabulary. So they use a lot of imagery. Right? Ahaziah began this story by going up to the lofty place, and he was brought down. Right? Right here, verse 4, he has gone up into his bed, and now God says, you will not come down. Right? The idea is that you're going to die in your bed. Right? You have exalted yourself, and that's where you're staying. But it's not an exaltation you're going to like. Right? Whereas Elijah, the prophet, he is being told, arise, go up. Right? And so just the imagery is that Ahaziah is constantly being brought down. The prophet is going up. Just visually speaking, you should kind of understand that it is better for one than the other. Right? Thus says Yahweh, you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but you shall surely die. Let me just check real quick, because I've got a sneaking suspicion that this is worded in a certain way. Yes, this is the same language of, remember back in the Garden of Eden? Whenever God said, if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall surely die. This is the same language there. It's just the word die repeated twice. Right? You shall die. That's how Hebrew speaks. Right? Anytime you're trying to emphasize something, you repeat it. Right? Truly, truly, I say to you. Right? You may eat of any tree in the garden, but if you eat from that particular tree, you will die. Right? That sounds weird in English, so we just translate it as surely die, but that's what it's saying. Right? So he says, you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but you shall die. The idea is that there is no going back.
So it's kind of like when Jesus says, very truly I tell you, he's saying, truly, truly I tell you.
Well, that's what he does. Yeah, so in Greek, keep in mind, it's in Greek, but Jesus is a Jewish person, so he still speaks like a Jewish person. So he says, amen, amen, I say to you. Right? Truly, truly. And so that's exactly why he does that. I just think it's so fun. That's like Jesus saying, listen up. I'm about to give you a truth bomb. Right? Truly, truly, I say to you. Anytime he says that, it's like, ooh, I need to listen. Okay. Therefore, thus says Yahweh, you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but you shall surely die. Then Elijah departed. What's he departing to do?
To go tell...
To go harass the messengers.
To go and deliver the message. To go and deliver the message, right? He's going to harass the messengers and just say, hey, you don't even need to go down to Ekron. I've got an answer for you right now. Do you notice how that's interesting? Right? They never actually get to go down to Beelzebub. God like intervenes and says, honestly, that God can't even give you an answer. You weren't asking for my opinion. I'll give you my answer anyways. No, you're not going to live. You're going to die. Right? Most likely, if they had gone to the prophets of Beelzebub, what answer would they have gotten?
What do you want?
They're false prophets. What are they probably going to say?
Oh, you'll live.
They'll say, oh, Beelzebub will be with your Lord the King, and Ahaziah will not die this day, and he will live forever. Blessed be his name. That's probably what they would say. And then Ahaziah would die, and be like, okay. And then they would still keep worshiping Beelzebub because they're stupid. But God says, I'm not giving them the opportunity for that. He's like, you're just going to cut in there. They didn't ask my opinion, but technically I am the God of Israel, and so they should have asked my opinion, so I'm going to give it anyways. I just think that's kind of funny. Like, that's just classic God right there. All right, moving onwards. So the messengers returned to him. So the messengers returned to who? Ahaziah, right? So the idea is that in between verses 4 and 5, this interaction occurred. So the messengers returned to him, and he said to them, why have you returned? And they said to him, a man came up to meet us and said to us, go return to the king who sent you, and say to him, thus says Yahweh, is it because there is no God of Israel that you are sending to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but shall surely die. And he said to them, what kind of man was he who came up to meet you and spoke these words to you? And they said to him, he was a hairy man with a leather girdle girded about his loins. And he said, it is Elijah the Tishbite. You can just like hear it, like, I just love that they just describe him and he's like, my dad told me about this guy. He's like, oh no, I was hoping he was gone for good. Alright, so what happens here?
So the messengers return to Ahaziah, and he's confused as to why they've come back so quickly. Because if they had gone all the way to Ekron and come back, it would have taken longer than if they had just gone to wherever Elijah met them on the road and then returned. And the messengers basically give him Elijah's message, and he's just like, who was this person? Because obviously he's like, okay, if this person claims to be speaking for Yahweh, then they must be a prophet of Yahweh. And when they described Elijah to him, he was just like you said, he was distraught. He was like,
take it.
this isn't good.
Yeah. I'm in danger. Yeah. Okay, so let's walk through it. So the messengers returned to him. I just want to highlight the word messengers there again. I did check. It is the same word for like whenever it says the angel of the Lord. It is like, that's why I just wish that people translated consistently. Right? One reason that I use this translation, the Legacy Standard, is because it usually does translate consistently, but for some reason here they don't. But it is the messenger of the Lord, and then you have the messengers from Ahaziah. Right? So it's like you've got these two kings in combat. Right? Ahaziah is one king, and God is the other king. They both have messengers, and these messengers aren't very good at their job. They didn't even listen to what the king said. Right? They just turned around and went back, and they're like, oh, I don't know, somebody else gave us an answer. I mean, like, if you just think about that, that's kind of silly. Like, that's like me being like, hey, Ben, can you go to Arlen's real quick and pick me up some milk? And then you're like, sure. And then you get up, you walk out the door, and then you get to like, or not even that.
Some random homeless man hands you milk.
Well, yeah, some random guy hands you milk, and you come in, and you're like, hey. And I'm like, how'd you get back so quick? Oh, some random homeless guy gave me milk. And I'd be like, all right, I have many questions. And also, like, next time, can you just do what I asked? But yeah, so that's kind of what's going on here. So the messengers return to Ahaziah, and he says to them, why have you returned? Nick kind of already mentioned this, but why does he ask this question?
I'm guessing that they returned so soon because he was expecting them to have gone and been gone for a while and then come back, but they just returned so suddenly.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to imply that they weren't gone that long. Like, he's like, wow, y'all made that trip super quick, or else you didn't do what I asked. And there also might be the implication here, and you don't want to read too much into it, there might be the implication that he realizes that they've already got an answer for him, right? You know, like, he's like suspicious, wait a second. You shouldn't have been able to come back that quick. Did somebody else who had more insight give you an answer? It's like, why are you back? Because there's no way you had time to go to Ekron and back and, oh no. Like, why are you back? Like, this, no matter what, this is not good. I either have messengers who are terrible, or they've got really bad news for me. And they said to him, a man came up to meet us. Right? Man came up to meet us, and he said to us, go, return to the king who sent you, and say to him, thus says Yahweh. And then he goes on and repeats the stuff from before. So, what does Elijah do? Now, obviously, we know what Elijah was told to do. What does he do?
Meets the messengers, tells them what he's supposed to tell them.
Yeah, Elijah does exactly what God told him to say. Right? God said, go and tell them this. Elijah goes and does it. I just want to highlight that because that's what Elijah always does. Right? Every time we see Elijah, God tells him to do something and he does it. There's very few characters in the Bible who are like that, but Elijah's one of them. Right? God speaks, Elijah obeys. Also, I would love to see what it was like interacting with Elijah. Because, like, just think about this. I mean, how he's going to be described in a second. He sounds like a kind of crazy dude, right? Like, just how they describe him. He's kind of weird. Yet they listen to him, right? I mean, think about that, right? You are on orders from like a king, right? Just like obviously we don't have kings here. Imagine that the president sent you to fulfill a mission, and then some random homeless person said, "You know what? Forget what the president says. You go back and you tell the president this." You would probably typically say, "Move over, homeless guy. I'm going to go and do what the president told me to do." But that's not how they responded, right? Apparently, and obviously they don't know who Elijah is, it seems like. Or else they would just say who it was, unless they're afraid to tell the king that. I don't know. But it seems to imply that they don't know who Elijah is. So there must be something about him that is just so charismatic or just like forceful that they're like, forget what the king says, we're going back. Like, I don't know what to do with that information. I just think that's interesting, right? They basically defy a king's orders to listen to some, just to obey the commands of some random hairy dude they came across along the road. That's just interesting. So, a man came up to meet us, right? Just a man. They don't say his name. They don't say it's Elijah. They don't seemingly know who it is. It's just a man. And ish, that's the Hebrew word for man. I just want to highlight that for you. It's going to be important later. A man came up to meet us, and he said to us, "Go, return to the king who sent you." So now the messengers of Ahaziah are becoming the messengers of Elijah, who is actually a messenger of the messenger of Yahweh. Like, if you're just thinking about that, so literally, the chain of here, it's like, these are the messengers of the messengers of the messenger of Yahweh, who are now no longer serving as the messengers of Ahaziah, but rather the messengers to Ahaziah. I just think that's funny. Like, you just see how in control God is.
Starts here, goes here, and here.
Yeah. Like, Ahaziah is so weak that he can't even get one group of people to listen to him. God is so powerful that he can command his messenger to deliver a message to somebody, who will then go and deliver a message to a group of somebodies, who will then defy their previous orders to go back and deliver Yahweh's message to the original guy who sent them. Right? Like, that's how powerful God is. Right? Whenever God wants to, I just want to highlight, once again, the subtext here and stuff. Like, this is where God's working behind the scenes, and you're like, wow, okay. If God wants something to be done, it's going to be done. Thus says Yahweh. What do you think Ahaziah thought in that moment? Because Ahaziah hadn't brought up Yahweh at all.
Like, oh no.
He's like, this ain't what we do.
Yeah, because it's like, wait a second. I never asked you to tell me what Yahweh said. I asked about Beelzebub. Where did you go? Did you go to Jerusalem? I didn't say go to Jerusalem. I asked. It's like, wait a second. You either went to the wrong place or Yahweh contacted me. And that's usually not a good sign. Like, if he's the one taking the initiative, well, if I had been faithful to him, that'd be a good sign. But I haven't been faithful. And so, like, just those first 3 words, thus says Yahweh, he probably is like, oh, I'm not making it out of this alive. Like, he probably could just predict the rest. Because it's like, oh, wow. Whenever a God speaks to you, and you did not initially try to speak to him, and you know that your ancestors have abandoned him and rebelled against him, you're like, yeah, I'm in trouble. One thing, I just wanted to look this up real quick. The name Ahaziah, it does mean Yahweh has strengthened. So apparently Ahab, despite all of his idolatry, did give Ahaziah this name. I'm just going to assume that maybe Ahaziah was born before. Well, no, because I'm assuming this is the son of Jezebel. I was going to say maybe he was born like from a previous marriage or something like that. I have no idea. But Ahaziah does have Yahweh in his name. Like, that's the Yah, right? Ahaziah Yah. But I just think it's interesting. Thus says Yahweh, is it because there is no God in Israel that you are sending to inquire of Baals above the God of Ekron? Once again, this hits a little bit different to the king than it would to the messengers. Right? To the messengers, it just sounds like a sarcastic question. To the king, this is just an outright rebuke. It's like, dude, did you forget about me? Am I nothing to you? Am I a joke to you? Did I stutter whenever I gave you the law? Why would you go inquire of Beelzebub and Ekron? Since when were the Philistines your buddies? No. I'm the God of Israel. If you want to know whether you live or die, you ask me. And so, I took the initiative and I decided to give you an answer. Therefore, you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but shall surely die. Notice that it says, therefore. What does that imply?
Because you do not inquire, you shall surely die.
Yeah. Which means that, hypothetically, if he had inquired of Yahweh, what might have happened?
Might have lived.
He might have survived. We don't know for sure, but that seems to be the implication, right? If he had humbled himself, despite being an evil person, as we read about at the end of 1 Kings, if he had just been humble enough to inquire of the right God, then God would have been merciful. But he says, but you didn't, right? You were evil from the beginning, you're still evil right now, and now you're never returning back to your upper chamber lattice. Sorry. This is your deathbed. Congratulations. And Ahaziah says to them, what kind of man was he who came up to meet you and spoke these words to you? So, why do you think he asked that question?
I think at this point he knows who said that. He's just asking for confirmation.
Yeah. I think he has a sneaking suspicion.
Yes.
He's like,
Yes.
thus says Yahweh, bad news. Huh. My dad told me about this one guy who I haven't encountered yet, but I've got a suspicion. And he's like, all right, just to be clear, will you describe this guy to me? Just real quick. Which also, what I love about that is that he seems to be so confident in who this person is that he thinks that simply a physical description about this person will confirm to him who it is. Right? I mean, typically, like, if Ben went outside and got milk from a homeless man, I wouldn't say, describe the man to me. I would just be like, Ben, get rid of the milk. Right? Like, if I'm saying describe the man to me, it seems to imply that I think I would be able to identify him given a description. Which tells you that, yeah, Ahaziah probably has a good idea who this is already. He's like, oh man, I'm in double trouble. This is not good. What kind of man was he? And they said to him, he was a hairy man with a leather girdle girded about his loins. So, how do they describe him? Hairy.
It was like John the Baptist, because he was compared to John the Baptist in the New Testament. So, just unpack you, that came to my mind.
Yep, we'll talk about that in a second. So, I want to read this in Hebrew to you real quick. Whenever it says a hairy man, there's different ways you can translate that. It could say a hairy man. A probably more literal translation is literally a man who possesses hair. It's weird. But, no, but listen. when I read it in Hebrew, you'll understand a little bit why it's worded so weird. Because in Hebrew, so man is Ish, right? Ish, Baal, She'ar. Ish, Baal, Baal, right? So, because remember, the word Baal means Lord.
Mhm.
This is the word Baal, right? He is a man who is a lord of hair, right? So, what is this conveying? This could be conveying a number of things. It could be that he literally is just like a very hairy person, or it could just be that he wears clothing of hair, right? Like, because most people back in those days would not wear stuff like that, but Elijah's just weird, right? He just like, he's just wearing like animal skins and stuff like that. It could be something like that, which would go along with like the leather belt and stuff like that. It seems kind of weird. Like if they're just describing him being hairy and then they just mention his belt, that seems strange. So that would lead me to think they're talking more about his clothing, and apparently that was a significant thing that stood out to them, right? He was a guy who wore hair and he had a leather belt. The main thing that we see here, the reason why I think it's worded in that weird way, is because the author is saying that Elijah himself is the Baal of God, right? And so there's the Baal of Ekron, and then there's the Baal of Israel, right? And the Baal of Israel is Elijah, right? He is the messenger of God, right? So the Beelzebub, he can't do anything, right? He's a dead god. He is a demon. He is just an idol, right? The Baal of Israel, right? The Baal of hair, well, I mean, he can do a whole lot, and he's not even a god. He is simply a messenger of Yahweh. He's a prophet. And so this is the actual Baal speaking. You wanted to hear from Baal? Well, here, you'll hear from the Baal of hair. It's just kind of almost would be a pun. But Ben, you did highlight something. What did you highlight about this?
Elijah and John are similar.
Elijah and John the Baptist. Yes. If you go to Matthew chapter 3 real quick. Let's do a little tangent, because why not? Matthew chapter 3, jumping forward. We read a very strange detail very early on. Whenever you hear about this guy named John the Baptist who shows up on the scene. This is what we read. And I can flip to it. All right. Matthew chapter 3, starting verse 1. Now in those days John the Baptist came, preaching in the wilderness of Judea, saying, Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. For this is the one referred to by Isaiah the prophet, saying, The voice of one crying in the wilderness, Make ready the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Now John himself had a garment of camel's hair and a leather belt around his waist, and his food was locusts and wild honey. If you're reading through that in the Gospel of Matthew, that's a very strange detail to read. You're like, why do I need to know that? Especially because whenever you read about other characters in the Bible, it doesn't usually stop to linger on their food and their diet, right? Or their clothing and their diet, right? It doesn't really tend to do that. But for some reason with John the Baptist, it does. If you read the Old Testament, you'll say, oh, well, obviously John the Baptist is supposed to be this Elijah-like figure, right? Because he's literally described as a man who's wearing hair, and he's got a leather belt. But then you have to ask the question, why? Why the heck? Like, all because he's Elijah-like, like, why would they draw attention to that? Why does Matthew feel the need to draw attention to that?
Because they possess similar qualities in their reference towards God.
Yes, so there is just like the literary parallel. That's right. Oh, like, hey, let me just save words describing John the Baptist by simply describing him like Elijah so that basically you can fill in the blanks, right? What Elijah was like, so John the Baptist was like, right? You can do that. Basically, if I wore these clothes and then you were introducing a new character in a story who was like me, you could say, oh, they're wearing the same clothes as David, and you're like, oh, okay, this person's probably a lot like David, right? So that could be part of it, and that is part of it, but it goes deeper than that. And once again, this isn't super relevant to 2 Kings, but since we're here, might as well look at it. These are the final words of the Old Testament, right? Malachi chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Literally, as you can see right here, blank page afterwards, and then it says the New Testament, right? These are the final words that the people of Israel heard from God prior to God going silent for 400 years. For behold, the day is coming, burning like a furnace, and all the arrogant and every worker of wickedness will be chaff. And the day that is coming will set them aflame, says Yahweh of hosts, so that it will leave them with neither root nor branch. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, and you will go forth and skip about like calves from the stall. And you will tread down the wicked, for they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day which I am preparing, says Yahweh of hosts. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, and the statutes and judgments which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and awesome day of Yahweh. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land, devoting it to destruction. So God says, I'm about to go silent. Right? He says, right now you need to focus all your attention on studying the Torah and applying it. And you will know that I'm about to do something new, and that judgment day is coming whenever Elijah the prophet shows up. He doesn't say that it's going to be like Elijah himself reincarnated or something like that. He just says, I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet. So, you flip a few pages over, and you're in the Gospel of Matthew. You read chapter 1, chapter 2, and if you are a Jewish person reading this, you're wondering, okay, if you're saying Jesus is the Messiah, well, there's somebody who had to come before that, right? Because God said Elijah will show up before the Messiah. And so, what does Matthew say? There's a guy named John the Baptist. He showed up in the Judean wilderness. Ironically, he shows up in the same area, which is near where Tishba was kind of at, right? He shows up, and he goes to the Jordan River. Next week, in 2 Kings chapter 2, we are going to see a story associated with Elijah in the Jordan River, right? This is where Elijah is going to ascend to heaven, right? Well, John the Baptist, he metaphorically descends from heaven right here, right? We know that he lived a whole life before that, but this is where he makes his big public proclamation at the Jordan River. The last place people saw Elijah, that's where people are going to see John the Baptist for the first time. What's he dressed like? Elijah. What does he do? He confronts wicked kings, right? Back in Elijah's day, there was Ahab and Jezebel. During John the Baptist's day, there's Herod and Herodias, right? And he's going to confront them about their evil sins. He's going to tell the people to repent and turn back to God. And he's going to say, I'm the one preparing the way for the Lord, right? So that's why Matthew highlights that in Matthew chapter 3, because he's trying to let people know John the Baptist is the Elijah. And sure enough, after John the Baptist is put in prison, Jesus confirms this, right? People come up to him and they say, what's the deal with John the Baptist? And he says, if you can believe that he is the Elijah that was to come, right? And so that's why that little detail is mentioned in Matthew chapter 3. It's because Elijah was known for being a hairy dude who wore a leather belt. John the Baptist was too. They're just weird guys. They're strange. So I just want to highlight that. So they said to him, he was a hairy man with a leather girdle girded around his loins. And he said, it is Elijah the Tishbite. Oh no, my dad told me about this guy. He was a real pain in my dad's neck. He caused a drought for 3 years. He destroyed all the prophets of Baal. He literally outran my dad's chariot one time, which was crazy. And also he got onto my dad because my dad had a dude killed for a vineyard. Oh no, I was hoping he was gone for good. He's back. Right? This is kind of like a new police chief in Gotham or a new mayor in Gotham realizing that the Batman is out of retirement. It's like, oh man. It's like, this city is way too corrupt for this to be good news for me. Alright, we continue. Then the king sent to him, so who is the king sending messengers to? Elijah. Then the king sent to Elijah a commander of 50 with his 50. And he went up to him, and behold, he was sitting on the top of the hill. And he said to him, O man of God, the king says, come down. And Elijah answered and spoke to the commander of 50, if I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. Then fire came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. Uh-oh. Oh, you think that's good? Watch this. So he again sent to him another commander of 50 with his 50. And he answered and spoke to him, O man of God, thus says the king, come down quickly. And Elijah answered and spoke to them, if I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. Then the fire of God came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50.
Oh my God.
You see that this is supposed to be humorous, right?
Yeah.
Like this is literally just the author. Like, I I don't like it whenever people suggest that the Bible is unbiased. The Bible is not unbiased, right? The Bible definitely has a bias. It wants you to worship the Lord, right? 2 Kings is a book of propaganda. And it is making fun of the people who worship anybody other than God. Like, to the author of 2 Kings, those people do not deserve to be respected, right? You don't call them Jezubel. You call them Jezubel, right? Jezebel, right? You don't call the god Beelzebul. You call him Beelzebub, right? He ain't the lord of nothing. He's the lord of the flies, right? And actually, the word for fly there is more properly dung beetle, right? So it's also dung, right? Just think about that. It's kind of funny. All right. So this is just the author just like making fun of this, right? He could have condensed this story down and just mentioned this happening one time. He says, no, I want to show you how stupid Ahaziah is. So the king hears about this, and he wants to talk to Elijah, right? He says, all right, Elijah can confront you. I want to talk to him face to face. I want to see this guy, and he can tell me face to face that I'm going to die. So the king sent to him a commander of 50 with his 50. Right? What does that mean? It's kind of worded weird.
So that's 100 men total?
No, but it sounds like that. But
He sends a commander and 50 men.
yeah, so he said, like, basically there's a dude who's in charge of 50 men, and he sends that commander with his 50 men that he's in charge of. Right? So this guy goes down. Well, actually, no, he doesn't go down. Where does he go? Up. Because you're going up to the prophet. Right? And he's sitting on top of a hill. Right? What's he doing up there? I don't know. Right? Elisha's just like probably just eating locusts and wild honey or something. So, and he went up to him, and behold, this is something that I always like to highlight. Once again, in Hebrew, you always see that word "behold" there. This is where the author is like inviting you to like see it through his eyes. Right? They're surprised by this. Right? They're just going to look for Elijah, and behold, there he is, just sitting on a hill. He's not even that hard to find. Right? It's almost like he was waiting for them. He's like, oh my gosh, were you expecting me? Huh, come on over here. And behold, he was sitting on top of the hill. And he, who is he? And he said to him, so the first he is who?
Was it the commander?
The commander said to him, Elijah. Okay, very good. So the commander said to Elijah, O man of God, the king says, come down. This is where I imagine, like, we don't know how extended this scene was. It could have been just this. But I imagine, just given Elijah's character, this is where he said, tell the king, see if I care. Right? Like, that's kind of how, like, he's like, okay, well, you know, the king also sent messengers to do a job earlier, and God had different plans, and they just went back to the king without fulfilling their task. And so your king isn't actually that powerful. Who? The king's telling me to do something. Oh, man of God, the king says, come down. All right, I'm going to highlight Hebrew here again, mainly just because there's puns, right? So the word for man of God here is Ish Ha-Elohim, right? So Ish, man, Ha-Elohim, of the God, right? Man of the God. The king says, come down, right? So he has gone up, the king says, go down, right? So once again, up, down, up, down, up, down. Spiritually speaking, this is what Ahaziah really wants Elijah to do, right? He wants him to come down to his level, but Elijah is going to refuse. And Elijah answered and spoke to the commander of the 50. If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. Now this is one of those places where, reading it in English, you might not understand the logic. But what does he basically say?
He's saying, if I truly am a man of God, you and your men will basically die.
Yeah. So I guess there is a logic to it in English, right? He's saying, let me give you a sign to prove this. What's the one issue with that?
You're not going to be able to witness it.
Well, yeah. I mean, if they die from this, they're not going to be able to really report this back, right? And so he just says, if I'm a man of God, well, then let me just consume you. But he is communicating with his judgment, right? You're over here willing to call me a man of God, yet y'all didn't come seek me out whenever the king was worried about his health. So don't try to butter me up with that title. But this is where you get to see the deeper meaning here. So the Hebrew word for man is ish. Do you know what the Hebrew word for fire is?
No.
Esh. Right?
Shush.
One letter off. Right? So, he says, if I am an Ish Elohim, then let Esh come down upon you. Right? If I'm an Ish, then I'll give you Esh. Right? There you go. Right? Alright, if I'm an Ish, I'll give you Esh. Right? And then it says, then fire came down. And this is going to be emphasized more in verse 12, because you'll notice it says, then fire of God. So, he is an Ish Elohim, and so the Esh Elohim comes down upon him. Right? So it's a pun. Then fire came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. So they asked Elijah to come down from the mountain, and Elijah says, oh, you want me to bring something down? Well, I'm not coming down from the mountain, but I can bring something else down from a much higher mountain. I can bring fire down from... like, he's almost acting like he misheard that. Oh, you want the Esh Elohim to come down? All right, here, boom. Very strange request. Oh, you said Ish. Oh, my bad. Right? Whoopsies. We all make mistakes sometimes. I guess you'll have to send some more. So that's kind of the whole joke here, right? Oh, you want the Ish Elohim to come down. All right? Lord, I don't know why they asked it, but send your Esh down upon them. It's like, I'm not like... all right, if you say so. Then fire came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. I feel kind of bad for these guys, right? I mean, they were just doing the king's job, and they died. But, I don't know. I mean, as my junior hires would say, womp womp. Let's move on. All right, verse 11. So he again sent to him another commander of 50 with his 50. Who is the first he here?
Yeah, man.
Ahaziah. All right. So, what does he decide to do?
Well,
He's like, well, the first 50 didn't work out. I'll send another 50.
Yeah. He's like, I'm sure this will go better the second time. All right. Well, let's do this. How do you think the second commander felt?
Oh dear.
He's like,
Probably scared.
he's like, I don't like this idea. It's like, okay. Well, the king said to do it, so we're going to go down and do it. And so, a second group of 50, they make their way down. And lo and behold, Elijah is still sitting on the same mountain. Oh, hey guys. Good to see you. I miss y'all. Wait, no, never mind. That's not the same group of people. Your friends died. Sorry. All right, but I'm glad that y'all are here. Do y'all have any requests? And he answered and spoke to him, O man of God, thus says the king, come down quickly. All right, so the message is not the same. What's the message this time?
The king said, come down now.
Yeah.
Quickly.
Yeah, it's like he's trying to pull a power move. He's like, hey, maybe the last guy stuttered, but King Ahaziah isn't kidding around. The last guy said that he asked you to come down. Well, it's not a question, it's a command. You better come down right now. Which is funny, because once again, this whole chapter, Ahaziah has proved himself to be powerless. Right? Literally, like, think about it. Like, let's look at all Ahaziah's done. He tried to relax, and he fell through the roof.
Yep.
He sent some messengers. The messengers didn't even do their job. They just came back with a message he didn't even ask for. Right? And the message was bad news. You're going to die. He sent out a commander of 50, and they were miraculously consumed by fire. Right? There wasn't even a battle. Right? It's not even like they faced off against a bunch of people. A prophet sitting on a hill called fire upon them, and they died. And now you got another commander who's like, hey man, Ahaziah ain't kidding around. And Elijah's probably like, whew, glad I wore my brown pants today. It's like, oh, I'm so scared, I'm shaking in my boots. It's like, oh, okay. But this is, once again, funny, because if anything, this just gives Elijah more room to mishear. Right? Oh, you want the Esh Elohim to come down quickly. Right now. All right. Once again, very weird request. Right? I mean, the last guy made it sound like a request and I granted it, but if you're commanding it, well, by all means, be my guest. I guess I will give you what you asked for. And Elijah answered and spoke to them, if I am an Ish Elohim, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. Then the Esh Elohim came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. Right? All right, man. You want Ish Elohim? I'll give it to you. It's kind of strange. Boom. Okay. Now, we'll return to our regularly scheduled broadcast in a second. But I got a question for you. What city are they nearby? Very good. Oh, y'all remembered. Thank God. Yes. Awesome. So here we've got a story about
Elijah basically went.
What's that?
So Elijah basically went all the way up to, Samaria then. So
Yeah, he's in that area.
So he's just.
He's
so
in
a
that area.
second ago he was in Jerusalem. Now he's just up there chilling.
No, so we never read he was in Jerusalem.
Okay.
We just read, we don't actually know where he encountered those other people.
Yeah.
Right? God just told him, go find them, and apparently he found them before they even really got that far, because Ahaziah was surprised when they got back. Right? And so he's somewhere near there. Right? And I'm assuming he's really close, or else he was sitting up on this hill for a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm assuming this stuff is happening, within a few hours of one another, so he's probably just outside Samaria. So to recap, we've got a guy outside the city of Samaria who just called down fire from God to consume his enemies. Does that sound like anything that you might be familiar with? Or maybe you're not familiar with it, but you're about to be, and it's funny.
I think of Moses, right? Did Moses put fire?
No.
It kind of reminds me of that story where fire comes down on Mount Carmel, and that's another story revolving Elijah.
So that is true, right? So Elijah in general is known for doing this. He has a nasty habit of, even though, to be fair, in that moment, the fire was consuming a sacrifice, not people. But Elijah is known for his ability to bring fire down from the heavens, which is pretty wild. I mean, whenever you ask people, like, what superpower would you like to have? That usually is never mentioned, but I mean, it'd be pretty sick, especially if you like cooking food. Boom, steak. But no, Luke chapter 9. This is what we read. Now it happened that when the days for Jesus to be taken up were soon to be fulfilled, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him. But they did not receive him, because he was journeying with his face toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? And he turned to rebuke them and said, you do not know what kind of spirit you are, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went on to another village. Have y'all heard the story before with James and John? If you've watched The Chosen, they do depict this. But there's a much deeper meaning to this, right? Now that you've read the Old Testament passage here, you're like, oh, I get it. Because here you've got Jesus and his disciples going through Samaria with their eyes set towards Jerusalem. If you know anything about the Samaritans, they did not view Jerusalem as a holy city. They viewed a different place as the holy city, a mountain called Mount Gerizim. And formerly, whenever Jesus passed through Samaria, they received him warmly. And they said, you're amazing, we love you. Remember John chapter 4 with the woman at the well and stuff like that? All right. So formerly, the Samaritans loved Jesus. But whenever they know that he is heading down to Jerusalem, all of a sudden they start rejecting him. Right? And they start saying, oh, we don't like that Jesus guy. He just cares about the Jewish people, and he thinks that Jerusalem is the holy place, and we know he's wrong. So now view this from James and John's perspective. All of a sudden, you'll understand why James and John asked this question. Because whenever you're reading the Gospels, it sounds very random. Right? You're reading it, and you're like, James and John, what the heck, dudes? Why do you want to consume them with fire? But view it from their perspective. Here, Jesus just sent messengers ahead of them to Jerusalem. Right? In this story, Ahaziah sent messengers not to Jerusalem, but where?
Samaria.
Well, he sent them to Ekron. Remember? Right? He was sending them somewhere other than Jerusalem. So he was viewing Ekron as the holy site. And so if you're just thinking of this from James and John's perspective, they're thinking, wait a second. There are people who are people sending messengers. Jesus is doing what Ahaziah should have done. Right? He's sending messengers to Jerusalem. James and John are seeing that the Samaritan people, like the people of Samaria in Ahaziah's day, they are rejecting Jerusalem. Right? Ahaziah rejected Jerusalem. Well, these people, the Samaritans, They reject Jerusalem too. What happened to Ahaziah's men? They were consumed with fire. And so, John and James, they asked Jesus, hey Jesus, would you like for us to do to these Jerusalem rejectors the same thing that you did to Ahaziah's Jerusalem rejectors in Samaria? Right? That's why they're asking that question. Right? Like, what they're doing, it's Bible study. Right? They're looking at this, and they're literally passing through the same land where all these events took place, and they're saying, oh, this is the same issue. All right, well, if God responded this way in the past, maybe he wants us to respond this way now. But Jesus says, no, that's not what we're doing here. And they just move on. Right? And he rebukes them. And so I just wanted to highlight that because hopefully that clarifies things, right? This is why we need to study our Old Testament. Because if not, you're just like, what the heck, James and John? That was like a weird thing to do. But it's actually a valid question to ask, right? They aren't asking out of nowhere. There's literally a biblical precedent for this exact scenario. But we also know from the Gospel of John, no wonder that John himself went to write this, for God did not send his own Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Right? John 3:17. You can see why the Apostle John, having experienced this moment, might highlight that. Because he realized that during his ministry, Jesus was doing something a little bit different. Right? He was not here to consume people with fire. He was here instead to preach the gospel and to share salvation with mankind. Right? And so I just want to highlight that so that like stuff like this will help you understand the New Testament better. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Back to our regularly scheduled broadcast. Let's continue onwards. We are almost done with this chapter. We have got verses 13 through 18, and we will get through it. So he again, oh my gosh.
Are you serious?
So he again sent the commander of the third 50 with his 50.
Oh boy.
Then the third commander of 50 went up and came and bowed down on his knees before Elijah. And he begged him and said to him, O man of God, please let my life and the life of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight. Behold, fire came down from heaven and consumed the first two commanders of 50 with their 50s. But now let my life be precious in your sight. Then the Malach of Yahweh, the messenger of Yahweh, spoke to Elijah, Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him. So he arose and went down with him to the king. Then he spoke to him, Thus says Yahweh, because you have sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, is it because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word? Therefore you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but you shall die. Alright, what happens here?
He goes down to the commander, it literally reiterates what he told the messengers.
Yeah.
Well, he's actually not going down to the commander. He went with the commander to speak to Ahaziah personally and said to him, like, the same message.
Yeah, it's really kind of funny. He's like, did I stutter? Like, what they told you is true.
Yeah.
Which sucks for Ahaziah, but I don't know. Really, you know what it really sucks for? Those 100 dudes who died. Just like, I mean, the first 50, that was bad. The second 50, I mean, that was needless. Right? That was just Ahaziah's pride. Right? He says, hey, I'm serious. This third commander, he seems to have learned the lesson. Right? And so I doubt that Ahaziah told him to do this. I imagine this is just him being a reasonable person who's probably afraid for his life.
Yeah.
So he again sent the commander of a third 50 with his 50. Also, I feel bad for the 50 guys, right? They don't even get to interact, right? They are simply following orders. Then the third commander of 50 went up and came, and he bowed down on his knees before Elijah. And he begged him, right? You get the impression that this guy, it doesn't necessarily mean that he is, faithful. It just means that he is scared, right? I mean, this dude, he recognizes that Elijah is more powerful than the king. Right? He recognizes that Yahweh is more powerful than the king. And honestly, that's where it all, once again, I can't say anything about this guy's faith. But that's where it begins, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? This guy recognizes, I don't care what the king tells me to do, I've got to come to this guy prostrating, right? I can't come here arrogant, right? The king probably said, go tell him I'm really serious this time. And he says, no. I'm on my knees, and I'm Ish Elohim. Right? And he's probably enunciating. Ish, not Esh, Ish. Right? Man of God. Please let my life and the lives of these 50 men, I'm going to check. I bet the word for life there is nefesh. Just not that's super important. This is why I need Sean to be here. Because Sean and I love nerding out about like language stuff. And y'all might like it too. But it's a bit nerdy. He bowed down and he said, "O man of God, nefesh." Right? The nefesh, like whenever we say life, it's like your whole soul, like your being. Right? Let our being be precious in your sight. Right? And the same for the 50 servants. Behold. Right? And I love that the word behold, like, the fact that he's using the word behold here, it's almost like he is inviting Elijah to view everything from his own perspective. Right? Obviously, Elijah saw this stuff. He's not telling Elijah new information, but he's just like reiterating how this is a big deal. Behold, fire came down from heaven and consumed the first 2 commanders of 50 with their 50s. But now let my life be precious in your sight. So he's saying, those guys, not going to lie, you didn't treat their lives as very precious. I'm not saying they didn't deserve it, but I'm asking you to just show me mercy. He's not saying he deserves that though, right? He's not saying, by being here on my knees, I deserve it. He says, I am at your mercy, right? I'm on my knees, I'm begging, I'm not making any commands, I am not trying to flex any authority over you. You're the one in charge. I am simply begging you for grace. Like he recognizes that Elijah has the power here, right? He is at Elijah's mercy. And we don't even see Elijah's direct response right away, right? Instead, it's almost like maybe Elijah got up and walked away to consider this. Because then the angel of Yahweh, the messenger of Yahweh shows up, right? Elijah's not going to do anything until God tells him what to do. The angel of Yahweh spoke to Elijah, "Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him." So for the first time, Elijah is being told to go down. But he says, even as you go down, don't be afraid, right? I will be with you. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Right? Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him. So he arose and went down to him, down with him to the king. Right? So he gets up. He grants the guy's request, and you know that every single guy in that 50 group person, man, they partied it up that night. They got home, they kissed their wives, they hugged their kids, they like probably had the greatest festivities ever. They're like, we didn't get burned alive. That's awesome. So they go to the king, and then he spoke to him. Who's the first he? Elijah. And he's speaking to who? Ahaziah, yes. So then Elijah spoke to Ahaziah, "Thus says Yahweh." Right? Yeah, and he's just going to repeat the same thing. He's saying, dude, you already heard this before. I'm going to state it again. One thing that I do think is kind of cool here is this is the first time that we've actually seen Elijah directly say it, right? Because this is the third time we've heard this message, right? The first time God said, Elijah, this is what you're going to say. The second time, it was the messengers repeating to Ahaziah, this is what the prophet said. And then now, for the third time, Elijah's actually delivering the message. And I think that's kind of cool because it's almost like you're following it from like I don't even know whose experience you're following from, but like, it's just cool that it's like getting closer to home, right? So it starts off very distant from Yahweh, right? Like, so Ahaziah, he can't hear Yahweh. He's not even inquiring of Yahweh. But then he hears it from his messengers, right? And then he hears it from the prophet himself, right? To where, like, it's like, I don't know, like, I just like to highlight the literary beauty of the Bible, right? This isn't anything, like, profoundly applicational or anything right here. I just think it's cool that, like, it's written that way. Like, it wouldn't be as beautiful if you had Elijah saying it twice, right? But instead, it was like you have it, the same message being conveyed in 3 different ways from 3 different groups of people. I just think it's kind of cool. Here's what you shall say. Here's what he did say. Now he's saying it. Because you have sent messengers to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, is it because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word? Did you think that there is no God here? Well, the events of the last few hours have proven different, haven't they? Where is your first commander of the 50s? Where's the 50? Where's your second commander? Where's his 50? All right. Well, now here I am, the prophet of God, standing before you, and I'm here to tell you there is a God in Israel. You should have inquired of his word. You didn't inquire of his word, but he's still got a word for you. Therefore, you shall not come down from the bed where you have gone up, but you shall surely die. He said, I came down from a hill to come here to you to tell you that you are not going to come down. Right? I had the luxury of going down that mountain. You will not have the luxury of coming down from that bed. Boom. End of the chapter. So Ahaziah died. Look at that. We don't even see Ahaziah's response. And we don't even see anybody questioning this. Right? And that's because one thing that you have to see throughout the Bible, when God says something will happen, it's going to happen. So Ahaziah died according to the word of Yahweh which Elijah had spoken. And because he had no son, Jehoram became king in his place in the 2nd year of Jehoram the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. Now the rest of the acts of Ahaziah which he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Alright, what happens there?
He died.
Elijah.
He died.
He died.
Yeah. Yeah, what the Lord said surely came to pass. So, Ahaziah dies according to the word of Yahweh which Elijah had spoken. Once again, notice the meta-narrative there, right? How God is being faithful through all of this, right? Even in an unfaithful situation, even with a terrible, wicked king, God is still doing what God does, right? He is speaking, he is communicating, he is being faithful, right? For Ahaziah, Yahweh's faithfulness is an unfortunate thing because Ahaziah was unfaithful, and therefore God's faithfulness results in Ahaziah's death. He should have repented, right? And because he had no son, Jehoram became king in his place. Who do you think Jehoram is?
I'm going to say son of Jehoshaphat.
That's where things get a little bit confusing.
Different king.
There are 2 different Jehorams mentioned in this one verse.
Oh, dear.
Yes. So Jehoram, the first Jehoram, is actually another son of Ahab. Right? Because Ahaziah, remember, he was only on the throne for 2 years. And so you get the impression he might have been pretty young when all this happened. And so he died without a son. And so it simply went to the next son of Ahab. Right? So Jehoram, son of Ahab, is going to become the next king. And that Jehoram becomes the king in the 2nd year of Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And so if you're looking at our timeline over here, you'll notice that I did write their names a little bit differently just to keep it a little bit easier for us. Jehoram is the more proper name. Joram is the shorter version of the name. But both of these guys' names is Jehoram. And so if you look, there is a time span in here, like basically a 7 or 8-ish year time span, where both the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah had kings with the exact same name. Which re-emphasizes what I said earlier about how one thing that the Book of Kings is trying to emphasize is how hard it was to just live at this time period to where you don't even know what's going on, right? Literally, 2 separate kingdoms, but the kings are the same name. There's Jehoram up here, Jehoram down there. And the way that the author words this is intentionally trying to make it confusing, right? Jehoram became king in his place in the 2nd year of Jehoram. What? Jehoram began to reign while Jehoram was reigning for 2 years. It's like, did I just have an aneurysm? What just happened? Right? It's like, did I have a stroke halfway through that verse? That's what it feels like. And you're supposed to feel that way because that's what life is like whenever you're embracing idolatry and sin, right? Things cease to make sense, right? Whenever you're embracing idolatry and sin, what do? Well, you send a commander to go inquire of a prophet. And whenever that prophet miraculously kills people, you send another one to flex your power. And whenever that prophet miraculously kills those people, you do it again. Because that's how sin works, right? It hardens your heart, it blinds your judgment, and you just start being stupid, right? And so, little subtle things like that. Jehoram and Jehoram. He easily could have just referred to the other Jehoram as Joram, because other places in the Bible do that. But he didn't. Instead he says Jehoram, Jehoram, like just to confuse us. Now the rest of the acts of Ahaziah which he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? To which we answer, maybe, I don't know. We do have a book of Chronicles in the Bible, but presumably that is the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah. Because 1st and 2nd Chronicles only talks about the kings of Judah, And we can't even guarantee that our books of Chronicles is the same thing that the book of Kings refers to as the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. That could be a totally separate book altogether. We don't know. But we do have a book that is called Chronicles, and it talks about the Kings of Judah, so it probably is the same book. But there seemingly was one about the Kings of Israel too. Alright, two things I want to do real quick. I want to read a few things from his commentary, just because I thought the guy had some really cool stuff to highlight. And then, while I'm reading this, I want you all to think of just some, maybe some application stuff we can take away from this. Because we've talked about the story. Let's, now that we've, studied it, observed it, interpreted it, stuff like that, let's see if we can try to find ways to apply it. Alright, real quick, I've got a few different passages I wanted to read here. Alright. So, this is, basically this is where the author is talking about that question that is repeated several times. Was there no God in Israel that you went to inquire of Beelzebub, king of Ekron? Right? That's like kind of the emphasis of all this. Right? And so, this is what the commentator says. A person's and culture's basic religious commitments are evident in their oracular practices. Obviously, Christians who consult horoscopes, drop in for weekly palm readings, or dabble with tarot cards possess a faith that is less than skin deep, but consultation with Beelzebub can also take more respectable forms. Right? So he's basically saying that we have our own Beelzebubs that we, inquire of today instead of God. Modern society relies heavily on experts, especially scientific elites who claim to be able to offer truth in a world dominated by opinion. Despite the purported shift to post-modernity, contemporary American culture is in this sense still deeply modern. In at least some of its main forms, the Enlightenment project is built on the belief that science is useful for undermining traditional superstitions and prejudices, and that such knowledge should be spread universally. Yet, at the same time, this scientific truth is actually discovered by various experts who alone have the training and insight to assess the truth of various claims. There are times for expertise. One would not want an amateur performing a quadruple bypass, but the post-Enlightenment reliance on experts is often a form of a practical idolatry, a version of consulting Beelzebub instead of Yahweh. Elijah could well challenge churches that rely on Freud for counseling, or Marx or Weber for their sociology and politics, or Madison Avenue for their evangelistic planning with the question, is there no God in Israel that you go to inquire of Beelzebub of Ekron? What he is not saying is that counseling is inherently bad. Right? He is not inherently saying that financial planning is inherently bad. What he is pointing out is that oftentimes we are very quick to consult those things before the Word of God, and that's a bit of an issue. Right? Our go-to should be go to Yahweh. Right? Because oftentimes we don't view, obviously inquiring of Beelzebub, that's a clear idol. Right? But if we're not careful, it's easy to elevate things to that same level without realizing it, to where we trust scientific dogmas over the Word of God. Okay, well, no. Let's see what Yahweh says first. Because we have good reason to believe that Yahweh is true. Right? And so let's look at what he says, and then we'll consider what the other stuff says. But if those things violate the Word of God, well, we're going to go on the side of the Word of God. Right? And so that's just one thing that he was trying to encourage there. And then, this is going to be a little bit longer too, but just hang with me here. This is talking about the going up and going down thing. The passage repeats go up and go down several times. The angel of Yahweh sends Elijah to ascend to call the messengers of Ahaziah. And Elijah's message is that Ahaziah will never come down from the bed where he ascends. Elijah's oracle, including the come down and go up, is repeated several times, and in between two captains with the 50 soldiers, they go up to the hill of Elijah to command him to come down. Instead of Elijah, fire comes down as Elijah predicts. The third captain goes up, and because of his humility, Yahweh tells Elijah to go down. Right? So because the commander went up and then fell down, then Elijah goes down. All this is precipitated by Ahaziah's fall from an upper chamber. Frequently in Scripture, the wicked are pictured as being destroyed by a kind of gravitational pull. They fall into traps and go down into the pit. This chapter reverses that symbolism. Though Ahaziah falls from height, as did his father's dynasty, at the beginning of the story, he dies in a high place, ironically reversing the initial cause of his injury. Elijah is high up, exalted like Yahweh on a mountain, but he comes down to deliver a message. This hints at the character of Elijah's prophetic ministry. A prophet has gone up to the presence of God and therefore can come down to deliver Yahweh's word. Elijah's ministry will end with an ascension going up that is not followed by a coming down. That's going to be in the next chapter. Even then, Elisha receives Elijah's mantle and a double portion of Elijah's spirit, so that in a sense Elijah comes down in Elisha to carry on the work. Ascending and descending are movements of a true prophet, a true messenger who climbs up and down a ladder to heaven. Elijah's ups and downs in this story not only symbolize his own authority as a prophet, but also suggest the character of the God he serves. Yahweh is high and lifted up, exalted above the heavens, but he also comes down. And in this, he shows his superiority to all the idols. God is not only higher than all the gods of the nations, he is also lower than all the other gods, descending deeper into the darkness than Tartarus or Hades can imagine. He does not simply throw fireballs from safety of heaven, but draws near, gets in our face, confronts kings with annoying prophets who interrupt their lives and plans. Yahweh refuses politely to recuse himself from human affairs. For many people, this is unbecoming to a God. Any decent, sophisticated God will remain where he belongs, in blissful heavenly repose, and have the decency not to meddle with our checkbooks, our marriages, our use of natural resources, or treatment of the poor. He will express no opinion on these subjects, but the God of Israel refuses to stay put. I just thought that was kind of cool. I just like the imagery of up and down and stuff like that. It's really neat. All right, throwing it over to y'all, then we'll wrap it up. Application, yes sir.
I have two.
Okay.
One you kind of already talked about, going to God before going to someone else.
Okay.
Go to God first. Then after that, I guess you can go to God first.
As long as it's not like Beelzebub or
Yeah.
Satan or
No idols.
Allah. Yeah.
No idols.
Yeah.
And the second is obey your masters.
Yeah.
Because the king told him to go. And then,
Yeah. Yeah.
or if God told Elijah to do that, he did that.
Yeah. Submit to authority. Like it ties into 1 Peter, doesn't it? Submit to authority unless the authority is violating the commandments of God.
Amen.
Right. All right. What else you got?
Learn from the first fire coming down from heaven.
Yeah.
Not to send something out.
Yeah. If God is trying to keep you from sinning, get the message the first time.
Yeah.
Right. Don't make it get worse. Right. Because your sins will affect others. Right. That's the thing. Right. Oftentimes we think that our sin only affects us, but we can bring other people down with us. Ahaziah, he died in the story, but he unnecessarily brought down 100 people with him. They didn't need to die.
102.
100. Well, yeah, I guess the commanders as well. Yeah.
Be
So
technical about it.
yeah. He's like, let's not forget those two. Those were valuable human lives. That's true. That's true. And so Ahaziah, he could have just died by himself, right? Because think about it. He had already received the message before he sent those commanders, right? The messengers that he sent brought that message back, right? He could have repented. He could have, he could have just died by himself. But instead, he insisted on pushing buttons, right? And he decided to double down on his sin, triple down on his sin. Don't be like that, right? Because the thing is, God is not beyond, as we see here, he's not beyond striking you down for your sin, right? And yes, the kings were held to higher standards, and so it's more often that we see that happening there. But that doesn't mean that God's beyond doing it. You get to look at Acts, and we see people that happening in the church, right? Ananias and Sapphira, right? And so God is not beyond that, right? In 1 Corinthians, Paul says that there were people who were dying in the churches because they weren't taking communion with the right heart. And so we need to be mindful of that, right? It's very possible that if we are allowing sin into our lives, God will afflict us, right? Or he might be gracious to us, right? Really, you can have good stuff in life and bad stuff in life. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're sinning or not, right? But whenever you are suffering, it's worth at least considering, right? You don't want to be like Job's friends in the book of Job and say, if you're suffering, you must be in sin. Not necessarily, right? Maybe God's testing you. Or maybe it's just a bad day, right? But it is at least worth looking at, am I allowing sin to creep into my life? Maybe that's why I'm suffering right now. It's just worth considering. And yeah, repent early. Be quick to repent, and also be quick to move on. Sometimes people will repent and then they'll just linger in their grief over their sin, and that doesn't really tie to this as much, but this is just like practical advice. Like, God's grace is sufficient, right? And so if you're going to ask Him for forgiveness, trust that He has given it, right? Because sometimes people are like, oh, like they feel like they're being like a good Christian by like moping around in their sin. Well, no, God, if He's forgiven you, get up and now just commit to being faithful. That is how you genuinely can, like be faithful to God. You're not being faithful by moping around your sin, because then you're almost like suggesting that His grace is not enough. No, His grace is enough. So repent quickly and move on and commit to being faithful, right? All right, anything else? Cool. Well, there is 2 Kings chapter 1. Next week, we will be in 2 Kings chapter 2, because chapter 2 follows chapter 1. And unfortunately, we're going to have to say goodbye to Elijah, which is sad. But don't worry. He's got a disciple who he's going to leave behind, and that dude's pretty cool too. And we're going to see that at the beginning, at the end of next chapter also. And we're going to get some really interesting stories. Well, we got a lot of cool stories to talk about next week. What do y'all want to close out in prayer? I guess y'all just want to hear... Oh, no! I was going to say I thought y'all just wanted to hear me talk some more, and I was flattered. Rocky, go for it.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful day, Lord. I pray that what we talked about today is that we come to you instead of going to someone else. I pray that what we talked about today, that we can apply to our lives, Lord. I pray that George's nephew or cousin continues to get better, and everyone here stays healthy, and watch over them, and he's staying in it.